We are going to get started. First, I want tonight to introduce Anna Kellar. Say it right? Kellar. Anna Kellar, who is with the League of Women Voters. Here to talk to us about the voter initiatives, the ballot initiatives that are on the ballot this year. So I'm gonna, without further ado, Anna.
Easy enough. All right. Hi, everyone. So I think probably most of you know, but the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that has existed in Maine and in the US since 1920. It came out of the groups that won the passage of the 19th Amendment and getting women the right to vote in the Constitution. And having just won the right to vote, they said, well, we have to be informed voters and actually everybody needs to be informed voters. And since that point, one of the key parts of our mission has been to educate and inform voters with clear and easy to understand information that tries to meet people where they're at. So what I have for you tonight is some information about the 5 referendum questions that are going to be on this year's ballot. I'm going to try to present a little bit of a pro and con as much as possible for each of them. This is how the league tends to work, that we try to give both sides of the issues. And I am sure that in this room, there are some people who might have worked on one of these or have strong opinions about them. And I would completely welcome you to also add your voices into this, because like I said, what I want to try to do is give that basic level of information so you know something, and then where you're curious, you can go look more. And I'll also mention just a little bit about some of the things that the league is doing to try to spread good information about our elections. And I have one request that I will get to at the end for how you can help me with that. But without going any further, I will go on with the presentation here. And click. Amazing. So we have 5 questions on the ballot this year, and they're different kinds of questions. Question 1 is a citizen initiative. It would, so a citizen initiative, people collected the signatures over the course of the last year, qualified this to be on the ballot. And go on, we have questions 2 through 4 are bond issues. Those were put on by the legislature to have state spending on a couple different areas. And then go to the last one. Question 5 is the flag referendum that was put on by the legislature going out to the voters. So they all came from different places, whether from citizen initiated or from the legislature. Go on. So question 1. Question 1 would limit the amount of money that a single person could give to a political action committee, no more than $5,000. And so that's what this is asking you. Do you want to set that limit? You go onwards. That question the intent is to put a limit on independent expenditures, not what the candidates themselves are spending, but what the outside groups are doing. This is an area that there have been a lot of restrictions put on, well, I say a lot of limitations on what is possible to do in this area. We've seen Supreme Court cases that have said that it is very difficult to regulate campaign finance spending. The group that put question 1 on the ballot is hoping by putting this forward to reopen those issues. The idea came from Larry Lessig, who is a Harvard professor, a legal scholar, who has an idea for how to get the First Circuit Court and the Supreme Court to reopen those questions by passing this referendum in Maine. Go on. Just trying to explain a little bit, what do we mean when we say independent expenditures? What do we mean when we say PAC and PACs in this case? All of this information that I have on the screen is also in a handout that I have for you, and we have it on our website as well. But I want to make sure, as you can see, we're trying to make the assumption that not everybody's going to know what these terms mean. I think probably most of you in this room, being as politically engaged as you are, do know that, but we know that a lot of voters don't. We can go on, just and can skip one more. So we're talking about here, a lot of people in Maine are very opposed to this outside spending. When we see the polling, it is very strong on different sides of all across the political spectrum. The effort to ban foreign contributions last year passed with 86% of the vote. That is why this is on the ballot this year, is because people looked at that and said, wow, well, clearly Maine is very supportive of putting limits on campaign spending. And go ahead. And then really what the cons are is that this is the argument that's been taken up by the Supreme Court, is that putting limitations on the amount of money that can be spent by any individual on these independent expenditures would be a restriction of their freedom of speech. I will say, so there's my people who are going to be for it and people who are going to be against it. Currently, we are not aware of any active campaign against question one. There is a small campaign in favor of it. What I will, and sort of opining here, what we're expecting to happen is that this will pass. It will go to the courts. And at that point, many of the people that I have talked to see it as probably unlikely that this Supreme Court is going to be willing to reopen this question, even though the arguments are very good. So my advice as you're thinking about voting on this is just to keep in mind that whether you support it or not, it may end up being a bit more of a symbolic vote or something that is showing what you want, but go into it knowing that whether it passes or not, it may be unlikely to ever go into effect with the courts are the way they are. Yes. The question was, could a clean elections candidate take the super PAC money? And no, that is one of the foundational things of clean elections, is that you cannot take any outside money once you're in the system, that you are only allowed to use your clean elections money. However, a super PAC could run an ad saying, we love so-and-so. As long as they have not coordinated that effort with that candidate, that can still happen. And we see that happen all the time. Whether the candidate wants it or not, we will see that kind of independent expenditures. Yes. Oh, sorry. Is this happening in other states or is it unique to Maine? And so far, this is unique to Maine. The Massachusetts Attorney General said that he thought it was not going to be constitutional, and they have a process in Massachusetts where they can stop something from going to the ballot if the Attorney General says, I don't think it's constitutional. And so they were not able to get this on the ballot in Massachusetts, then looked at Maine. And part of the reason why this New England is because the First Circuit in the federal judiciary is one of the few circuits that has not actually ruled on an independent expenditure question. And so they're thinking that this is potentially an opening. And I should say that while I may sound cynical about this, that's not a reflection on the merits of the issue as much as it is thinking about the politics of the court and the moment that we're living in. Okay. I'm going to go ahead through the bond questions and then happy to take more questions at the end, including if you've got other thoughts about the campaign finance side. So question 2 is a bond question. Bonds are allowing the state to finance long-term investments, usually in infrastructure of different kinds. There's limits to what you can make be a bond. But our legislature, the last session, decided to pass 3 bond questions to put out to voters. The first one, and go ahead. So this one would be a $25 million bond that would put in money toward research and development. What this is looking at is around science, biomedical technology, looking at things around agriculture and aquaculture and information technology and renewable energy. It's very open. The idea is that there's a lot of federal funding that could potentially be drawn into Maine if Maine was also able to make these investments. So that's where the bond is going. It's looking at economic development by investing in technology and research. It's based off of a plan to try to improve our science and technology basis in the state. And part of that was what fed into this bond. We can go ahead one more. I think, yes. And so, like I said, it's a very broad things that could be funded. It's looking to use the Maine Technology Institute as the entity that would make the decision about which things specifically would be funded. But so that's not, you're not being asked as a voter to fund particular projects, but to create a pocket of money that could then be spent based on this plan. Okay. And so this came out of bills. We're looking, and like I said, looking at trying to increase in particular ideas around biotechnology in Maine, but it could be used in a bunch of different ways. And so keep going. We can see what you'll see how we talk about bond questions in general is that it is often, we tend to see that bonds pass. Usually if they've gotten through the legislature enough to be sent out to voters, there's pretty strong support for them. Some people will vote against bonds simply because they don't like the idea of spending in a particular area. We may also see people deciding not to have the state take on more debt. And so when you look at the ballot, there's always an explanation of what is the current load of debt that the state is carrying and what is our current bond rating. Maine has been in a very good position recently, which is part of the reason why the legislature was choosing to put out bond questions this year. Yes. So if they're approved, who decides on what it can or should be spent on? And it depends on the particular bond, exactly how that works. In this case, it is the Maine Technology Institute that is going to be making those decisions. And with the different bonds, sometimes there is already a plan with original legislation pointing it toward a specific thing. In this case, it's more like creating a pool of money that then people could make. Either they would have an open process for applications or they would have some kind of a public process for deciding where those grants of public money would go out. But it does raise a great question, which is something that we think a lot about, I would say, in the league, which is oversight over these government programs. We have the Office of Program Evaluation and Government Accountability, OPEGA, and they review some of these programs, including tax expenditures and tax breaks for different corporations. And that is a really important part of this, is keeping an eye on where the spending ends up going and if it's actually generating the benefit that it's supposed to be generating. Right. And so these bond questions are very straightforward. Voting yes means you want the bond, voting no means you don't. Great. And so question 3, this is looking at refurbishing historic buildings. Maine has a very old housing stock. We also have a lot of historical buildings. This is attempting to have a $10 million bond that would allow, in particular, government and nonprofit organizations that own historic buildings to be able to apply for funds to restore those buildings. And so there's also a match requirement here from either local government or nonprofit as well, so that any entity that would be applying for the funds from this bond would also have to put forward some of their own funding as well. You can go ahead. And so here we're talking about funds that would come as a grant with that grant requirement of that local match. And this, for people who do historic preservation, this is very often the kinds of things looking at getting money from the state, local, or federal government in order to try to maintain historic buildings, as well as raising money through other philanthropic efforts. And what this would do is create an extra pot of that money that's not having to come from general revenue or taxes, but would come from this bond. And so this was, again, came out of a bill in the legislature, and it has had support from both legislators in both parties. Again, that's usually the case in order for something to get through as a bond, that it has to have quite a bit of support in the legislature. Great. And really here, we're coming down to, do you think that we should be spending money on fixing up old buildings? And do you think that the state should be borrowing money in general? Those tend to be the reasons why you might vote against it. You'll see this starts to get very familiar, because a lot of the things with bonds, people who vote against them tend to be against the spending in general, more so than against the particular issue, but that's not always the case. And so, again, very straightforward. And so we can jump to question 4, I think should be the next slide. And so question 4 is an interesting question, I think, because we often see bonds for transportation and for roads and highways and bridges. That's probably the most common thing that you'll see a bond for. And this is interesting because it is saying the infrastructure that it's trying to build are trails. Some trails that could be used for motorized ATVs and snowmobiles, some that couldn't be. And it is, again, something that is a $30 million bond, but then it would have a requirement for at least $3 million of matching funds that would be already, need to be raised from other sources. And so really, what this would do is that there would then be, if this passes, a process to develop a program and a strategy for investment in these trails. And then that Maine Trails program would be using those resources based on the guidelines that were in this piece of legislation to make those investments. Again, this is looking at both some trails for motorized use, some that will be multi-use, and looking at the need to maintain this infrastructure over the long term when we're dealing with climate change. So again, it's familiar, came from a bill sponsored by Democrats and Republicans. And I think that's a kind of an interesting example of how you've got both an environmental and an economic argument for this bond working together. All right, and cons. I think that this is, again, quite similar. We can see that the arguments in favor tend to be matched by the arguments against. You don't want to build more trails. You don't want to, or think that this isn't a good use of state money. And so, again, very similarly, if you're going to be in favor of the bond, you vote yes. If you're against it, you vote no. All right, and that brings us to the last question, which I think is probably the only one of these questions that I've heard anybody talking about outside of the legislature or us working on writing our guide, which is about the state flag. This has been going on for a debate that's been going on for quite a while, and now as voters, we're finally getting to vote on it. So there's been the effort to change Maine state flag back to the old flag that we had with the pine tree and the star, away from the flag that we have now, which is the seal with the soldier and the farmer, or sailor and the farmer. And so that is what this question is asking. Do you want to change the flag from the one we have now back to this older design? There is a specific design for what the new old flag would look like. You can go ahead. And so the question does give you a description of like, this is what the old flag is, this is what the new flag is. And what it's arguing is that it's a better reflection of the state, better reflection of the state's culture than just using the seal. And go ahead. Our current flag, and then the proposed new flag. And this is the design that it would be. And go ahead. And so I think really what it's trying to look at is that this has become very popular. People have been using it in tourism and souvenirs and as a symbol of the state, as Maine tries to attract people to come here and buy our stuff, as well as have our own pride for it. And so we've seen it be really popular, but there's some, potential cons that could come with this. And that's really, some people might like the older one. They like that it has the main motto, the Dirigo or I lead on it. And then the other argument is that it could potentially cost the state some money in order to change this flag design on all of the places that we have flags. And so whether that's something that we want to actually invest in doing. All right. And so again, a yes vote is you want the new flag, and a no vote is you want to keep the current flag. Thank you so much for your attention as I attempted to tell you about some things in both very basic terms that are not always the simplest here. And we do have, I mentioned, all of this in writing. Both I have some print copies and we have it all listed out on a website, so that if you want to refer back to any of this, click on the links for those bills and read about them in more detail. That's all available. I want to use my last couple minutes here before I pass over to Will, just to talk a little bit about what the League does and our goals in producing this kind of resources. And we know that one of the biggest reasons why people don't vote is that they don't feel confident that they know enough. And especially when it comes to things like bond questions, local candidates, people running for county commissioner because they don't know what a county commissioner does. I mean, who knows what a county commissioner does? Maybe some of you do, but not many people. And I think that kind of lack of knowledge can come with shame. People feel like they should know, maybe other people know. And so trying to make information be as accessible as possible at a basic level, in things that people can pick up and read on their own time, in videos that you can watch in little quick segments on YouTube, and in our website, which is vote411.org, which lets you put in your address and it will show you everything on your ballot with information about it, as well as information about your polling place, how to vote, and your rights as a voter. Having all of this information takes a huge effort because, as I'm sure many of you know, none of this stuff is, or very little of it, is provided for us by the state. It takes volunteers doing the research and writing this stuff up. It takes a lot of people distributing it and getting it out into the world, getting our guides into coffee shops, sharing all of this information through your social media. But in particular, when it comes to our ability to cover things at the local level, that's where we really need the help of as many people in Maine as possible, and especially people like you who are paying attention to what is going on in your communities. So we have a program, and you can go ahead, that is new this year, but it's a new version of an old idea, which is just calling it Adopt a Town. And the idea is that we want to have one or more people, ideally in every town in Maine. We're not there yet, but that's the goal, so that we can cover the local elections in every town in Maine and not just be able to say, okay, do you have a municipal thing happening on your ballot right now? But who are those candidates? Going and getting those candidates to fill out some basic questions in a questionnaire so people actually have information about this. And that's where we think that of all of the voter education that we can be doing, we're going to see the biggest return on our effort in these local elections and in these places where people don't feel like they're already inundated with information. In fact, they're really hungry for information. And so we are looking for volunteers to help us adopt a town. Very simple at its basic thing. We are just looking for people who can call up their town clerk, say, what's on the ballot? Do you have a sample ballot yet? Can I see a version of it? And put that information into a spreadsheet so that we can put it in the guide. You could do more. We have other programs to help engage people around local elections, around election observation, all of those things. But at its basic level, that's all we're looking for. A lot of you may already know this, may already be asking for other reasons. That's why I'm making that request to you all specifically, because I know you're already going to be connected into these spaces, talking to the clerks. Maybe you know people who are running for local office already. Maybe you're running for local office. You can really help us fill out this map. So my last slide. We're doing okay right now in Lincoln County, I will say. We have a number of towns covered. We also have a number of towns that we're missing. A lot of the smaller, more inland towns, but also we don't have Booth Bay Harbor. So what we're looking for, you could adopt your own town, but you could also adopt a neighboring town if your town is taken. And so I will leave you with that request, and you'll hear a lot more about the many other things you can be doing from a partisan side to support this election. But I will say that as you're thinking about that, if you can put a little time in toward helping the league, we are very appreciative. These are the towns that currently have somebody. If that's your town and you think, oh, but I'd like to know who that is and maybe I could help them, definitely still come talk to me and we can figure that out, because sometimes if we have a couple people in a town, hey, maybe we could do more than just the basics. But also, like I said, we know we're going to have gaps. Maybe you know somebody who's in a town where we have one of those gaps, or maybe you think, oh yeah, well, I could just pick that other town as well. So when we get into the nitty gritty of it, I'm happy to dig into it. And I don't want to take your time right now because you've got another speaker. But I will hang out and you can talk to me. I can definitely take, like, I see a eager question. I can definitely take that, but I will say the other thing that you can do is just go to lwvme.org/adopt. That lets you see the whole map and you can put in your information, and my colleague Deb, who is coordinating this program, would reach out to you to coordinate it for you as well. So that's another option.
Anna, thank you so much.